Hi, and welcome to our very first Blydyn Square Books workshop, The Bitter Truth About Submissions, What You're Doing Wrong When You Send Your Work to Agents and Publishers. Today, we're just going to go through some of the most common mistakes that we encounter when we receive submissions here at Blydyn Square Books and how you can avoid them. We're going to try to get through them as quickly as possible. That way you'll have some time at the end to ask any questions you have about the process. Let's get started. If you've ever tried to write something more involved than, say, a book report back in school, you know all too well that writing is not easy, and trying to get your work published is even harder. If you haven't already given up and chosen to resort to self publishing, or if you never had the guts to submit to traditional publishers in the first place, like so many of us these days, you've probably experienced your share of rejection. And whether the publishers you're looking at are big or small or somewhere in between, you know that rejection is inevitable. Even the greatest writers get rejected if a particular agent or publisher isn't looking for what they're selling. Now, we've all heard the stories about famous writers being rejected dozens, even hundreds of times before they achieved success. But even so, getting all those rejection notes yourself never gets any easier. After a while, you can't help taking it a little bit personally, which is probably why one of the top things aspiring authors ask me when they find out that I'm an editor is, what am I doing wrong? Today, we're going to do our best to answer that question, outlining some of the top mistakes we see in submissions and giving you some simple advice for how to avoid them. To make this easier and, I hope, a little bit more fun, I want to introduce you to some of our favorite characters. It's a lineup of literary criminals, if you will. These are the kind of folks we encounter on a daily basis when it comes to submissions. So let's get started. First up is no spell check Nathan. His mistake, not proofreading his work. Now, when I say that Nathan isn't proofreading his work, I don't mean that he failed to take the time to have his manuscript professionally edited before he sent it in, though all aspiring writers should be doing that, but we'll talk more about that later. Here, I just mean that Nathan didn't bother to run a simple spell check on the pages that he's sending for consideration. When I get a submission this way, it makes me wonder what dinosaur of a system he's using, since pretty much every word processing program these days highlights your errors right there on the screen and makes it super hard to ignore them. Still, somehow we get dozens of submissions, if not hundreds, every year with very obvious misspellings or missing letters or missing words right in the cover letter. Just as an example, in our friend Nathan's submission, which was for a memoir focused on his Jewish upbringing, on the first page of his excerpt alone, he spelled the word matzah, one that's bound to come up more than a handful of times in a book about Judaism, 3 different ways, and it was clearly not on purpose. I gotta say, come on, guys, is it too much to ask that you make sure the first few pages of your submission are perfect? If you can't handle checking a couple of lines of text, how can we trust you to make a whole book into, a good thing into decent shape if we want you to do some revisions? But enough of Nathan. Let's move on to our next character. Generic Jenny. Her mistake? Sending her work blind. Now, what I mean by this is that Jenny found herself a list of publishers and agents somewhere online and is now sending the exact same submission without even bothering to change the cover letter to every single one of them. Now, I get how it feels to be an unknown writer. I've been there. It seems like publishers are these evil, faceless monsters. But believe it or not, actual human beings like us work in publishing houses, and we do notice when you ask us, a publisher, to represent your book. Agents represent, publishers publish. If you're sending the same generic letter to everyone on your list, don't expect us not to notice that. And don't expect us to want to work with you. If you can't be bothered to send out a unique submission to every place that you're submitting to, then we can safely assume getting you to do any revisions for your book are going to be like pulling teeth. And you can't blame us for wanting to work with another writer instead. Next up is Renegade Roberto. His mistake? Refusing to follow the rules. Now, writers like Roberto think they're too good for the rules. Instead of reading and following the submission guidelines on our website, Roberto decided he would make a bigger impact if he bypassed the submissions process entirely and instead pasted his relatively incoherent message directly into our Contact Us website form, which is, where people write in to, ask about our newsletter or things like that. It has nothing to do with submissions. Here's what he sent. I'll let you kind of read it on your own. And just bear in mind, as it says here, this has been pasted exactly as it was received, so all the errors are original. I've only changed things like the title by removing it, that sort of thing, so that, I don't expose anybody's writing. Now, after I read this, my first response was, okay, wow. First off, who outside of the circus says gentlemen and ladies anymore? But that's not such a bad thing. The bigger point is, if he had done any research, he would know we don't publish poetry. And then third, is it just me or does he come off as kind of a jerk? I mean, he's too good for contests, and if he had bothered to read our website, he would know we are in no way a hybrid or subsidy publisher, so the implication that we might be is really just offensive. Way to make a first impression, Roberto. I feel like telling you to crawl back into your hole now and take your crappy poetry, which was beyond crappy, by the way, with him. But okay, that's the sort of thing I'd like to say, but instead, we have to be nice. So instead, we directed him to our submissions guidelines page and told him to read the submissions guidelines, and submit as outlined there. He tried again, this time contacting me directly. By the way, my email appears nowhere on our website, so somehow this guy tracked me down, making me think he's kind of a stalker. Here's what he said. I'll let you read it for yourself. Again, he harps on the whole doesn't want to pay anything and he's too good for contests. So I read this, and I was kind enough to once again explain to him where and how he needs to submit, directing him to our submissions page and our acquisitions editor, which I am not. I'm the editor-in-chief. And instead of actually doing that, he sent me yet another response. Honestly, if I could just push a button and eliminate all people like this guy from the earth, I think the whole world would be a much better place. But for now, let's move on and meet ignoring us Ava. Her mistake, not paying attention to what we want. Ava doesn't read, and that's a problem. Now, when I work with writers, I tend to harp on the whole to be a writer, you need to be a reader first thing all the time, and rightfully so. But that's not what I'm talking about here. When I say that writers like Ava aren't reading, I don't mean they're not taking in enough literature. I mean they're not taking the time to read the directions. Yes, like you learned in kindergarten. When you send your submission to agents or publishers, you need to first read their submission guidelines very carefully until you are 100% sure that you have done everything precisely right. Ava and people like her don't do that. In this case, it was actually the submitting author's agent who didn't bother to read the directions. Now, first off, by sending an agented submission to Blydyn Square Books when our website clearly states that we prefer to work directly with authors, not agents, it was kind of obvious that Ava wasn't paying attention, and it was equally obvious that her agent needs to be fired. One big reason we prefer to avoid agents is that so few of them seem to have any clue what they're doing. Trust me, guys, if you're a writer, it's easy enough to piss off a publisher on your own. You don't need to have someone do it for you, much less someone who's taking a cut of your profits. The point is, your submission is your first impression. And if you come across as someone who doesn't think a publisher or agent is worth the 30 seconds it takes to read 3 lines of text on a submissions page and learn precisely how to submit the work, then we don't think your book is worth our time either. Next up in our lineup of literary criminals is wrong contact Connie. Her mistake, sending the submission to the wrong person. Connie's submission arrived in the email inbox of Blydyn Square Books' marketing director, Elliot Wise, rather than, where it belonged, in the inbox of acquisitions editor, Megan Scamwell. Now, I get that some publishers make it kind of difficult to figure out the name of the appropriate staff member to whom you should be addressing your query. And seriously, I feel for writers who have to play detective while going through the process. It sucks as it is. However, Blydyn Square Books, as you can see here, is not one of those publishers. Our submission guidelines clearly state where the submissions should be sent, give Megan's email and our mailing address, along with lots of detail about what should be sent and how. And yet we frequently, probably more than half of the time I would say, get queries addressed to poor, overworked Elliot in the marketing department. Here's the thing, if you can't figure out the correct person to whom you should be sending your submission, especially when the information is clearly stated, it comes back to revisions for us. How can we expect you to be smart enough to handle any revisions that need to be made on your book? The brutal truth is, it's easier for us not to risk it. So it makes more sense for us to reject your submission now than to try to help you get things right. Next up, I want to introduce you to Too Busy to Read the Guidelines Gary. His mistake, not reviewing the submission guidelines thoroughly. Obviously, this point goes hand in hand with the previous ones, but I still think it deserves its own mention because I see mistakes in this area so often. In the submission in question, Gary wrote a very thorough, even compelling description of his book. He explained which popular titles the work might be compared to and how he envisions the book being marketed. Unfortunately, he also noted that his book was intended for a young adult YA audience, and at least at this time, Blydyn Square Books doesn't publish children's or YA titles, though we do have some plans for the future, so stay tuned. Again, this is something that is clearly mentioned right on our website, but from the query, it was obvious that Gary never bothered to read the submission guidelines. Like generic Jenny and ignoring us Ava, Gary is simply doing bulk submissions and sending the exact same query to every publisher or agent that he comes across without taking the time to check what each one wants. My advice is do your homework. Don't send an erotic novel to a Christian prayer book company, or don't send a fantasy trilogy to a military history specialist. You need to tailor your submission to each and every publisher and agent you're submitting to, taking the time to follow their guidelines precisely. Failing to do so is a guarantee that your submission will be rejected, and rightly so. Next up is Forgetful Fiona. Her mistake? Forgetting to include her submission. Yes, you heard that correctly. This particular writer inexplicably forgot to include her work. The query letter was there, as was her contact information, but the sample pages were curiously missing. In essence, there was no submission submitted. Now, sure, we could easily have contacted this woman, Fiona, and said, hey, did you kind of forget something? After we stopped laughing, of course. But then again, why should we? Isn't including the pages, the actual submission, kind of the most important detail? If you forgot that, what else are you going to forget if we try to work with you? No thanks, we'll be moving on. Next up is Dazed and Confused Damien. His mistake? Having no clue how the publishing process works. I'm going to share actual examples from Damien's submission just so you can see that I'm not making this stuff up. Here we go. And obviously, again, the details have been changed to protect the not so innocent. I'll let you read this on your own. Okay, first off, if Damien already has a publisher, and Bloomsbury is a legitimate publisher, don't they already have the option on his new book? They almost certainly do, which makes us have to assume that he's either sending out his new work in violation of his contract, or Bloomsbury has already rejected the book, which probably means we won't like it all that much either. My advice is it's better not to mention this sort of thing and risk starting off on the wrong foot. Next, he writes, let me know if you like it, blah, blah, blah. And here, although I'm totally on board with the concise letter, our friend Damien has neglected to tell us what the hell the book is. Is it a novel? A memoir? A biography? An expose of the meatpacking industry? Give me something to go on because, frankly, the writing in the sample that he attached was so bad I couldn't hazard a guess. If you want to be a published writer, you have to have at least a basic understanding of how publishing contracts and the process of turning a manuscript into a real book happens. Otherwise, you kind of come across like a little bit of a nut job. In fact, we're thinking about doing a webinar on that, going through the stages of the publishing process, so stay tuned. But for now, our next criminal is clinging to Minutiae Manuel. His mistake, thinking we care about lots of tiny publishing credits. Again, I'm going to share some of the actual submissions so you can see it in all its glory, or whatever the opposite of glory is. Here's what we received. Now, first off, as we've already discussed, Elliot is our marketing director and has zero to do with submissions. Second, this submission uses a really old address, one that hasn't been valid in almost 6 years, so you kind of have to wonder where the writer is even finding such outdated contact info, and why they're including so much shipping information in an email submission. But let's move on. Now, here we go again. If this person had read our submission guidelines, they would know that 1, we don't publish romance. 2, we don't publish work shorter than 65,000 words. 3, we're very particular, and that means you need to be meticulous with your cover letter. And by the way, sloppy person, you need a hyphen in that 50,000 word thing right there when you're using it as an adjective. As an editor, that makes me cringe. Plus that extra space after the comma before the 150. Ooh, it makes an editor just totally cringe. It's a visceral reaction. But anyway, Fourth, we also hate a synopsis and we don't accept complete manuscripts or attachments. So clearly, this person has paid zero attention to any of the details. Next up, they give us this very long list. And as I read it as an editor, I have to say I know it sounds brutal, but it makes me a little bit sad. I get it that you're proud of what you've published, and you should be, but people outside of your own family and your friends don't care. And secondly, this kind of upsets me also as an editor, because if this person doesn't know that the names of the publications need to be italicized, they so don't deserve to appear in their pages. Sending a list like this, where it's pretty much all obscure periodicals, to a publisher makes the publisher wonder if you're kind of making them up. We'll get things like people who uh, send a classified ad to their church newsletter and then finagle it so that that appears to be a publishing credit. So something like this makes us think that's what they're doing. Frankly, we would rather publish a first timer who's willing to take direction than someone whose work has appeared in a handful of, random online magazines and now thinks they're the real deal. I don't know what it is, but something about getting a piece published in, an obscure literary journal somewhere seems to turn normal people who are good writers into lunatics with giant egos. I beg you, don't let this happen to you. Anyway, this author's work was attached in its entirety as a PDF when, again, it's quite clear that we don't go for that sort of thing. So it was a disaster all around. But let's move on to our next criminal, who is Outright Liar Otto. His mistake being flat out full of falsehoods. This is another favorite of ours. He writes once again to Elliot, not the correct person to approach. Okay, let's take a look here. Now, our website, first of all, hasn't been under construction ever. Even while we were revamping it well over a year ago, it remained up and functional the entire time. So we know this guy is just trying to be sneaky. He's playing the faulty technology card in the hopes of bypassing the real process and getting someone he thinks is the gatekeeper on his side. Elliot, by the way, is not the gatekeeper, so this guy has really made a big mistake and come off as kind of a jerk. He then goes on and he says he's, found our guidelines in Poets and Writers, which clearly he didn't, because I know for a fact that they have our acquisitions editor, Megan's name, not Elliot's, because Elliot would have nothing to do with submissions. And I know that they also say that we only accept the first 50 pages. So you have to ask, do people think we're morons? Nobody likes being manipulated. You don't like it, I don't like it. No publisher, no agent likes it. And we don't like to be deceived or treated like an idiot. All we ask for you to do is be honest. We're going to get along famously if you do. But unfortunately, it rarely happens. In fact, in some cases, authors end up just like our next character, Tricky Tracy. Her mistake, more lying and basically fraud. Now, let me just say something for the record. I love working with writers, I always have. But sometimes you guys can be, pardon the French, real assholes. We received a submission here at Blydyn Square Books that pretty much contained all the mistakes I've just been complaining about, while also demonstrating what a jerk this particular person was. Now, first off, the submission came from an agent, which, as we've already discussed, we're not big fans of. Second, it had an elaborate query letter and synopsis, which, again, we don't consider important, as clearly noted on our website. And then the manuscript itself was riddled with, spelling and punctuation errors right from the earliest pages, which showed us that the agent who sent it was flat out lying when she claimed that the book had been fully edited. But worst of all was another deceit, a much bigger one, something that told us we would never want to work with this particular writer. So what was it? It's kind of hilarious, actually. When we replied to the agent's email to acknowledge receipt of the submission, she immediately emailed the author, her client. Or so she thought. In reality, thanks to some very sloppy email skills, the so-called agent actually wrote back to us, not the author, and said, "They took the bait. They really think I'm your agent and they're going to read your submission. I told you I could fake it even if I don't know anything about the book business." People, I implore you, if your friend isn't bright enough to check the to line when they're sending an email, he or she is not the correct choice to play your pretend agent. In fact, nobody is a good choice for such a dishonest and, frankly, idiotic maneuver. Need I say it, this person is not going to be getting a contract from Blydyn Square Books. For some crazy reason, we prefer to work with people who don't go out of their way to deceive us. Next up, I would like to introduce you to one of the most shocking writers we've encountered in recent submissions. Pardon the French, but batshit crazy Barry. His mistake? Being out of his mind and thinking we won't realize it. Now, I'm going to print Barry's letter here in its entirety, just so we're all on the same page, no pun intended, and again to try to prove that I am not making this stuff up. This aspiring writer and solid contender for title of craziest person in America said that he submitted a novel for our consideration and blah, blah, blah. But first off, let's say the email was not sent to our submissions department where it should have been, but to our marketing department. Poor Elliot once again, even though it has exactly nothing to do with reviewing submissions. Now, naturally, when Elliot saw this message, he immediately sent it directly to me, probably assuming it would make a good addition to my collection of wacky submissions, and he was right. It is a fantastic example of a terrible way to approach a publisher. But let's talk a little bit about why specifically. I'm going to set aside the misspellings and the use of all caps that immediately demonstrate the writer is clinically insane. Instead, I'm going to confine my criticism to his wild claims. Now, the writer says that he submitted a year ago to a specific editor and he names a Sally Scamwell, someone who has never worked for Blydyn Square Books, and we assume he meant Megan Scamwell, and has very poor attention to detail. I mean, really, dude, take 10 seconds to look up the person's name before you make this kind of wild, crazy claim. So, anyway, I looked into this and I found out that he did, in fact, receive a rejection from our acquisitions editor, Megan, a year ago. But the rejection simply informed him that the 50 pages he had sent in were not right for our list and wished him luck with his writing. There was no mention of us dying to publish his work if only we could afford to do so. Trust me, if the publisher never asks to see your full manuscript, they aren't interested. Yet somehow in this writer's mind, we not only want his book, which, mind you, we rejected a year ago, but we're ready to get into a bidding war with another publisher just to acquire it. This guy is clearly in need of some serious mental health counseling, or better yet, a long stay in a padded room. The bottom line, if you're as crazy as this person, please seek some counseling, not publishing. Editors are very busy people. We don't have time to deal with your schizophrenic ramblings. I am sorry if that sounds harsh, but it's just the truth. But for now, I want to conclude this lineup of literary criminals with "Won't Leave Us Alone, Lucinda." Her mistake, following up early and often. We get it. You want to get published, and it's really hard to wait and wait to hear news about your submission. You're sure it's a masterpiece, and you figure we'll agree as soon as we read it. The thing is, you've got to remember that your masterpiece, if indeed that's what it is a needle in the haystack, and there are dozens or even hundreds of pieces of hay ahead of you in line. I'd kind of like to tell you don't follow up with an agent or publisher at all. If you haven't heard anything, consider no news bad news and move on. But I understand sometimes you need closure. I just beg you to please wait at least until after the publisher's stated reply time has passed before you start hounding them. Our friend Lucinda here sent her submission in less than 2 weeks ago. Now, the average publisher takes about 6 to 8 weeks to reply to submissions. Our submission guidelines, because we're so small, say that it should be about 3 months, maybe even 6 months before you hear anything. If you're already demanding a reply from us before 10 days have passed, let's just say you're not giving us a warm impression. Be patient. Getting published is about playing the long game. And that's really just a quick overview of some of the most common errors we see in submissions. And I think we can all agree it's not hard to avoid these and many other mistakes. And frankly, these tiny things are all that stands between you and successfully attracting a publisher or agent's attention. Robert Fulghum probably put it best when he wrote, "All I really needed to know I learned in kindergarten." It certainly holds true when it comes to submitting your work to agents and publishers. Pay attention to detail, be considerate, be honest, follow directions. These simple bits of advice make it easy to make your submission stand out from the crowd. One thing you should realize, publishing is a small-ish world. Editors and agents often know each other, even more so now since the rise of social media has made it easier to know people you've never actually met. Don't think a bad submission to one tiny press like Blydyn Square Books won't matter in the grand scheme of things. Editors do talk, and we do remember the good, the bad, and the crazy. So if you're making one of these mistakes and you blow your chance with Blydyn Square, it might not seem like a big deal. But here's the thing. I'm definitely going to tell my friend at, say, Simon & Schuster about it if she happens to mention she's thinking about signing you. It's a small world, so don't burn your bridges. Do your best to treat people with kindness and respect, just like you'd want to be treated. It really does just go back to that. It's that easy. Now, up until this point, I've basically been sharing the kinds of mistakes that I see in submission materials. I'm talking about cover letters, synopses, that sort of thing, as opposed to issues I find in the actual work. For the most part, I can't tell you what you're doing wrong in the actual writing because so much of that is subjective. I might think your werewolf themed sci fi novel is absolute garbage, but somebody at a small horror press might fall head over heels in love with it. There is no accounting for taste, and it's very subjective and it comes down to what different presses like. One thing I would like to note, you do not have to include a copyright or all rights reserved notice on your manuscript. First off, no legitimate publisher or agent is going to try to steal your book. Trust me, most of the books we get in are so bad we don't want to sign them, much less steal them. And you shouldn't be sending your work to, shady criminals, so you really should have nothing to worry about. Secondly, legally, your work is protected by copyright law the moment you create it on screen or on paper, whether you add the copyright symbol or not. And here's the thing, when publishers or agents see that little note where you declare yourself the copyright holder, we know that you're kind of naive about the publishing business. A publishing lawyer once told me, the copyright note is the mark of the amateur. Don't bother. It makes you look a little bit naive and, you might as well just avoid it. That, however, is a really minor thing. The number one huge mistake I see in virtually every submission that we receive is this: when the author fails to send the work out to a professional editor for a thorough content or developmental edit before sending it to us. Now, this is probably the biggest and most upsetting development I've seen in my career, with the exception perhaps of the decline in quality that's been caused by self-publishing, but that's a rant for another workshop. 20 some years ago, when I started out in the book business, all a writer had to do was send a fairly clean copy of their draft into the publisher, and if the publisher liked the story, the writer got a contract. Things have changed. These days, because it's harder than ever to sell books, publishers, especially small ones like Blydyn Square Books, just don't have the budget in terms of either time or money to spend developing sloppy work. We need and expect your first draft to come in as polished as a diamond. Okay, maybe just a ruby. You can't get your work that shiny on your own, no matter how great a writer you might be. And your Aunt Sally, who taught third grade, can't help you either, even if she offers to help edit your book. You need a professional, and not one of these people who self-published a book on Amazon and is now out there hawking their services as an editor. You need an actual professional editor, someone who has worked in traditional publishing for years, being trained in the finer points of what makes a great book. These people are expensive and worth every penny if you want your submission to stand out from the pack. It's the only way. I'm sorry about that, but it's the truth. The bitter truth, if you will. See what I did there? Now, that's about all. Here is our submission guidelines page, which you can find anywhere on our website, blydynsquarebooks.com. And if you want some more information about improving your submission or improving your writing in general, please feel free to order a copy of our newly released book, which I wrote along with a bunch of our our Blydyn Square book authors who've written various books. For example, award-winning author Edward de Maurier, whose novel 33 Cecils is about to become a major motion picture starring Matthew Modine. So if you want to get a copy of the book, just use the coupon code BITTERTRUTH to show that you've attended this workshop, and you'll get the book for only $10, including shipping. So thanks so much for attending. And as always, if you have anything you want to know, reach out to us at info@blydynsquarebooks.com, and we'll be happy to hear from you. Thanks.